Between 1485 and 1551, the people of England were repeatedly afflicted by a mysterious and deadly disease that has left historians baffled for centuries. This illness, known as sweating sickness, seemed to come out of nowhere and wipe out hundreds of people before vanishing just as quickly. And while we know some basic facts about this bizarre disease, exactly what it was and how it killed so many people remains unknown. Hi everyone, I'm your host, and you are watching this channel. Today, we are going to explore one of history's most baffling mysteries, the disease that wiped out the Tudors. The year is 1485, and England is in the midst of a brutal succession crisis. Richard III, the last Yorkist king, has just met his demise at the Battle of Bosworth Field, and the country is eager to move on. Enter Henry Tudor, who after a quick coronation as King Henry VII, sets about securing his new throne. His first order of business, Mary Elizabeth of York, Richard's niece, thus uniting the two warring factions under one banner and beginning a new dynasty. And everything seems to be going well. The marriage is a success, and Henry is even able to set about repairing the damage done to England during the War of the Roses. Then suddenly he falls ill. What follows is a swift and mysterious demise, and by August 11, 1485, Henry VII is dead. While contemporary sources offer no real explanation for the king's sudden death, historians have since attributed it to a common medieval ailment, sweating sickness. Sweating sickness was a disease marked by an abrupt onset of symptoms such as violent aches, extreme fatigue, and copious sweating. Victims could die within hours of the onset of symptoms, which likely contributed to the disease's alarming mortality rate. While the timeline of the disease is hotly debated, at least 5 epidemics occurred between 1485 and 1551, with hundreds dying during each outbreak. But after 1550, sweating sickness seemingly vanished, leaving researchers with more questions than answers. Exactly what was this mysterious illness, and how did it kill so many people? Unfortunately, there is no simple answer to these questions. In the years since Henry VII died, scientists have put forward a number of theories, but none are universally accepted. One theory is that sweating sickness was an extremely virulent strain of influenza. Proponents of this theory point to the fact that the disease spread rapidly through England's population and struck victims with no warning, much like the flu does today. However, influenza does not typically have a mortality rate of 30% or higher, as was the case with sweating sickness. Another theory is that sweating sickness was a form of smallpox. Smallpox is a viral infection that causes fever, headache, vomiting, and a distinctive rash. In the past, it had a mortality rate of up to 30%. However, there is no evidence that smallpox caused sweating, which is a key symptom of the disease. A third theory is that sweating sickness was caused by a bacterium known as Yersinia pestis, which is responsible for the plague. This bacterium typically spreads through fleas and has a mortality rate of 60%. However, sweating sickness did not appear to spread in the same way as the plague, and not all victims showed signs of the disease's other symptoms. A fourth theory is that sweating sickness was caused by ergot poisoning. Ergotism is a disease caused by a fungus that grows on rye. It causes the blood vessels to constrict, which can lead to gangrene and death. However, there is no evidence that ergotism caused sweating, which is again a key symptom of the disease. Finally, a fifth theory is that sweating sickness was actually a pandemic of unknown origin. This theory is attractive because it does not require any new pathogen to explain the disease. Instead, it posits that sweating sickness was caused by an unknown virus or bacterium that had been circulating in England's population for centuries. The pathogen only became more deadly during the 15th and 16th centuries, perhaps due to changes in climate or human behavior. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same. Within hours of feeling the first symptoms of the disease, victims would be dead. Now exactly why this happened is unknown. However, one thing is clear: sweating sickness posed a grave threat to the people of England. Entire communities could be wiped out in a matter of days, and the economy ground to a halt. As the disease spread throughout the countryside, people abandoned their homes and fled to the cities. Shops and businesses were shuttered and trade virtually ceased. With so much at stake, it's no wonder that those in power took drastic measures to try and stop the spread of the disease. Unfortunately for them though, those efforts proved largely ineffective. In an attempt to prevent the spread of sweating sickness, Henry VIII issued a series of mandates in 1528. These included closing down all gatherings and celebrations, prohibiting people from traveling into or out of infected areas, and requiring that the sick be isolated from the healthy. However, these measures only had a limited impact on the course of the disease, and people continued to die in large numbers. The situation was made even worse by the fact that there was no cure for sweating sickness. Once someone was infected, they were essentially on their own. Physicians offered little more than bloodletting and other ineffective treatments, and most victims died within hours of being stricken. Those who did survive the illness were often left with permanent health problems, including paralysis and blindness. Now, while the disease was devastating, it did eventually run its course, and the English were able to get back to their lives. However, the experience left an indelible mark on the people and the country. Sweating sickness played a role in shaping English society and culture, and its legacy continues to be felt today. To see how? Let's take a look at the wider context of the epidemics. We've already touched on how the Black Death devastated Europe's population, but the effects of this pandemic were still being felt during the 15th and 16th centuries. In fact, some historians argue that the Black Death had a profound impact on European society and helped to usher in the Renaissance by creating a labor shortage that gave rise to new economic opportunities. However, others argue that the Black Death had a much more negative impact on Europe. They point to the fact that the pandemic led to widespread famine and social unrest, and that it set back Europe's development by killing so many people. Whatever the true impact of the Black Death was, it's clear that the people of England were still reeling from its effects when sweating sickness hit. Now, the timing of the epidemics is also interesting. The first outbreak occurred in 1485, just as Henry Tudor was taking the throne, and the last outbreak occurred in 1551, just as Mary I was dying. Some historians have argued that the timing of the epidemics was no coincidence, and that the disease was actually a form of divine retribution. This is based on the fact that the disease seemed to strike down the most powerful people in England, including 4 kings. However, there is no evidence to support this theory. Finally, we need to consider the context of the epidemics. Sweating sickness occurred during a time of great upheaval in England. The country was changing from a feudal society into a modern nation-state. New technologies were being developed, and old traditions were being challenged. Some historians have argued that these changes created a climate of fear and uncertainty, and that the sweating sickness epidemics were a manifestation of those fears. In other words, the disease was a product of its time. To learn more about sweating sickness, I've been reading a book called The Mystery of the English Sweatings by John Kingdon. The book is a fascinating exploration of one of history's most mysterious diseases, and it has really helped me to better understand the context of the epidemics. Kingdon does an excellent job of piecing together the historical record, and he offers a number of fascinating insights into the nature of the disease. For example, he argues that sweating sickness was probably not a single disease, but rather a complex of diseases with similar symptoms. He also argues that the disease was probably not caused by a single pathogen, but rather by a combination of factors. If you're interested in learning more about sweating sickness, I highly recommend checking out The Mystery of the English Sweating. It's a great read, and it will help you to better understand one of history's most mysterious diseases. So while we may never know exactly what caused sweating sickness, or why it killed so many people, John Kingdon's book does a great job of exploring the mystery and piecing together the historical record. If you're interested in learning more about this fascinating disease, I highly recommend checking it out. Now, if you'd like to learn more about other historical diseases, I also recommend checking out a book called Plague, The Black Death and the English Fly. The 14th century, the world was drastically different from the one we live in today. Feudalism had not yet fallen, and vast swaths of the populace believed the world was flat. In the span of a few years, all that would change, and you won't believe how. Thank you so much for watching.